So a couple weeks ago, I attended the Shine Summit at Harvard University, which was in partnership with the Harvard Human Flourishing Program and Shine. And it was really all about the intersection of work and happiness. And namely, how can work or the workplace be a vehicle for promoting the well-being and human flourishing of society? And so basically in this video is just going to be my notes from the conference, the highlights, and I'll include some resource in the comments for a little bit more in-depth, but we're going to run through and we're going to cover a few things, right? So a lot of this is at the intersection of work and well-being. So I'll touch on a model or an overview of how to cultivate happiness and well-being in the workplace. I'll touch on a few kind of miscellaneous business applications. And then finally, we'll talk about how to turn around a struggling business. So maybe you're not the CEO of some massive company, but something you can apply if you're interested at all in business leadership or even team leadership or really any organization. So let's just jump in right with the model right off the bat. So they talk about, well, you're thinking about happiness at work or well-being at work or flourishing at work. There need to be certain requirements for that, right? Sort of like to have a plant grow, it needs sunlight, it needs food, it needs water. Maybe food is a bad term. It needs soil and nutrients. And so the researchers broke that down. They said there's really several factors you think about that go into supporting a happy or a flourishing work experience. So you need relationships, which are based on social connection and psychological safety. And psychological safety being essentially a feeling of trust and a feeling that that environment's safe for interpersonal risk taking. So you can ask questions, you can make a mistake, you can sort of put yourself out there a little bit, and not that you won't be held accountable, but that if you kind of mess up a little bit, you won't be like fired or embarrassed or talked down to or something. So we need healthy relationships in our workplace is ingredient number one. Then you have meaning, which is a sense of purpose or connection to the organization's purpose and the impact of that organization. Then you need balance, right? So adequate time for personal renewal, which means kind of not feeling overwhelmed, whether by the hours worked or the difficulty of the task. Because ultimately, if you feel like you can't really manage your work effectively, it diminishes something called self-efficacy, which ultimately is kind of like detrimental to our psychology. So self-efficacy is the sense that we have the ability to choose what we're going to do and then actually follow through on it and manage it effectively. And so if we're really overwhelmed and we can't really get things done and perform well in our work, it sort of diminishes our efficacy and hurts our self-esteem a little bit. So number four, autonomy, which is a reasonable amount of control over how one works. Of course, that's somewhat context dependent. Where if you're an executive at a consulting firm, you have a lot of autonomy. Whereas if you're on an assembly line, you have not so much. But it still means that you have some amount of say and control over how you do the work to get the outcomes that are required of you from your organization. Compensation, that's a simple one. If our financial needs and we don't have a sense of basic financial security, that's been shown that that sort of sets a foundation where in other areas we're not going to be able to really flourish if we don't really have that basic sense of security. Recognition, 6. So our contribution to the team or to the organization need to be witnessed and shared back to us. So we're actually feeling some of that recognition. Mastery, which is opportunities to grow and develop. We all have an inherent psychological need. So again, we're talking about essential psychological ingredients for happiness here, not just like, oh, well, it's nice to have this. So we all have a need for mastery to feel like we're getting better and developing our capacity in certain areas. And then finally, your environment. So the environment needs to be safe and not like physically or emotionally damaging. So, free from physical hazards, of course, but as well as like psychological hazards like emotional or verbal abuse. So running back through, you got relationships need to be quality. Have some sense of meaning and connection to the purpose of the organization. Adequate balance, autonomy, compensation, recognition, mastery, and a safe environment. And when you get all those right, you're going to flourish at work. Okay, moving on, I'm going to go through here some just sort of brief applications that relate to business and how business aligns with well-being. So in 1977, 583 people died in the worst aviation accident in history. It was with the Pan Am flight collided with a KLM flight. And something interesting here. So they collided on the runway. But in the one plane, there was a junior pilot who actually told the senior pilot, hey, we didn't get the right signal for takeoff. We're not cleared to take off. We should stop. And the senior pilot, right, said, well, what's the hierarchy? You don't tell me what to do. You're a junior. I'm senior. We're going. And then unfortunately, of course, they collided. Well, what's the lesson there? Well, since then, particularly in aviation, a lot of leading airlines have developed cultures that have a less rigid hierarchy, and particularly when you're talking about here the psychological dynamic. So a hierarchy where bottom up feedback is acceptable and safety is the priority. So it's totally reasonable for a low level employee to sort of talk up to someone if it's about safety. And at the conference, they gave an example of this where I think it was like a maintenance technician, right? Very low level of the organizational hierarchy. And there was a senior, very tenured pilot who did something wrong and kind of said, no, you don't know what you're talking about. And the technician reported it, and they went and immediately fired the senior pilot. So what is this about? It's saying that when you have an organization where hierarchy trumps outcomes and trumps safety, you're going to get disastrous results. 583 people die. And so you want to cultivate a team dynamic, and then of course that expands to department and organizational dynamic, where sure, you can have some hierarchy because you need to keep people organized, but there should be a culture that's hierarchy less, where outcomes are much more important than the sort of dynamic. And a lot of that goes into practices around role modeling and cultivating psychological safety within the organization. Again, psychological safety being not some like PC term, but meaning that people feel safe to speak out, to ask questions, to admit to mistakes, to say, hey, something seems off here, without fear of being punished or condemned, especially punished through informal channels, right? Where it's sort of like, oh, did you hear that tech spoke up to a pilot and that sort of thing. So that story illustrates an important application for business, right? Where you're cultivating a cultural climate of open communication regardless of hierarchy. Next story came from a Harvard researcher named Ramon Sanchez. This was an amazing story. He was a plant manager in Mexico before he became a researcher. And he said they came up with this initiative that they were trying to save millions of dollars at the plant. And they said, all right, here's what we're going to do. The employees can suggest ideas, innovative new ideas for cost savings, and we're going to pass back 10% of savings to the employees. So you think about that perspective, right? Employees get a great deal, surplus value, not related to salary or time, but they're getting a share of the value they create. And then, of course, for the employer, you're capturing 90% of that financial value. And he shared one story of an assembly line guy who was making $30,000 a year, and he proposed an idea that saved the firm almost $1 million. And so that guy got a $100,000 bonus that year, which is equal to several years of salary, and the firm also won. So I thought that kind of framing is an amazing intervention that really any organization could do. If you're a software company, maybe your developers get 10% of the increased revenue from a new feature, or again, you have like a blue collar environment or a trucking company, and then any employee who comes up with a cost saving idea, they get 10% of those savings back. That is a tremendous way to incentivize innovation, again, bottom up in the organization. And then at that plant in Mexico, I should add, I forget the exact number, I think I might have it in my notes on it, but they saved something like, I think, tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars under that initiative over several years. So pretty good tool to have in your toolkit there. Finally, I was really inspired by the folks at Next Jump, which you can Google that, but they're one of the leading training organizations that have a network of top military leaders, top government leaders, top business leaders, and they kind of have created this knowledge base of, what are all the key principles of leadership and how do large organizations function and how they not function, and particularly how has that changed over time. And they talk about a needed shift between basically what we have as 20th century leadership is kind of modeled after the Industrial Revolution. So think about your educational experience. Basically, you're giving very tangible tasks that are well defined. There's a right way and a wrong way. You do it. You get to class 45 minutes, then you go to the next class, and it's very like assembly line. And there's very distinct things about right and wrong. And ultimately, your goal in education, right or wrong, tell me, is to just never be wrong. Right? That's how you get an A, right? You can't be wrong. You're giving a very tangible, concrete, well-defined task, and you're not allowed to do it wrong. Well, the problem is in the 21st century, you're leading a large organization, we have a dynamic that's called VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So we have a lot of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And so what you have is you have all of these workers and leaders who have grown up in this system where it's all about basically having very clear, defined tasks, and you know what's to be done, and you're not supposed to be wrong. But you're in an environment with high ambiguity. Things are very complex and they're very unclear, and they're moving at a really rapid rate, and there's really no right answer. And so that's where we see so many crises right now, where our social institutions, our political institutions, and our businesses and organizations oftentimes are not functioning very well. It's sort of a lack of the right psychological tools for leaders. And so I don't have time to go into all of it now, but they use the analogy of saying that most of us as leaders have developed an overactive autoimmune system. And so we have this immune system that all the time is worried about making ourselves not be wrong. And so within organizations, it looks like everyone is essentially doing two jobs: the job they're paid to do, and then the job of making themselves look good and making sure they're not, people see them doing things and they're putting on a good face and whatever. And so they advocate a need to first overcome our own psychological immune systems and learn to be wrong, learn to embrace ambiguity, and create more of an experimentalist or an iterative approach to figuring things out. So if you think about like a 20th century leadership model, it's, okay, we know we have all the information, things are moving pretty slow, we know what needs to be done, we don't want to get it wrong, so we're going to plan it out for a really long time, and then we are going to do this. What's required of us now with so much change and dynamics and volatility is more like, hey, a lot of what we maybe should do is in the dark here. We don't really know. We have this amount of information. We need to move quickly, and we may be wrong. So we need to be agile. So we're going to test these three things. We're going to see which one works, and then we're going to double down on that. And then if that works, we're going to adjust. Or if it doesn't work, we're going to do it differently. And then we're going to keep iterating. So you can start to see a little bit of a shift there from a very slow, methodical, have to be right, to a more lean or agile, iterative, and experimental framework, which is essential ultimately for navigating ambiguity, complexity, and volatility. So finally, I'll share a little bit here on how to turn around a struggling organization. So this came from Hooper Jolly, who was the CEO and chairman who turned around Best Buy. Can you imagine that? That's no easy task. And he said he has a simple framework. So you're facing a struggling organization. Number one is increase revenue. Number two is cut non-salary expenses. And then number three, last resort, is to cut salary expenses. So he talked about taking over Best Buy. The first thing he had to do was make them competitive with Amazon. So he negotiated new purchasing deals with suppliers to make sure their prices were competitive. They signed new distribution deals to make sure their distribution times were effective. And so they weren't losing out money to Amazon. Then you start to look at non-salary expenses. Well, they were losing something like $1 billion per year in broken TVs and broken electronics. So he said, okay, we got to cut that, right? And so we found those sorts of opportunities to cut non-salary expenses. And then finally, right, last resort, you look at salaried expenses, but they had actually very few layoffs or things like that. And I thought a final really important part of his message was, once you sort of start executing correctly, you do not want to lose sight of a compelling, inspiring purpose of the organization, which I thought was kind of cliche, because I'm like, you're Best Buy, you sell basically like useless but nice to have consumer electronics. And he said, no, well, think about it this way. So this is a real story that he did. He said, At Best Buy, our mission is to use technology to improve people's lives. That's a bit more expansive than selling consumer electronics. And so they did that, and they actually ended up spinning up something called Best Buy Home Health, which uses the Internet of Things. So your Amazon Alexa, your smart TV, or whatever, they can actually monitor the movements of elderly people. And using AI, if it detects an anomaly like, oh, they've been in bed all day, or they're stuck on the floor or something, it can notify a family member or notify a home health monitor to go in and check on them. So I'm not saying I would want that. I think it's a little sci-fi weird, but you can see how you went from, okay, we're just selling TVs and cameras to, oh no, we're actually really innovating here and having an impact and having a purpose. So I thought that the way he taught that application of purpose was rather compelling, because so many times you hear, oh, we're all about changing the world, but we just sell Pepsi, right? So yeah, you're selling carbonated sugar water. No one gives a shit. But in this case, it felt fairly authentic deployment of purpose in a way that ultimately is going to support the well-being of the workers and, of course, the customers. So the final message I would leave you with from this conference, there's a lot of good nuggets there, and I'll link to those organizations as well as some of my notes on this. It came from a man, Daniel Shikani, I talked to. He's a very influential leader and thinker. He said, I think what's needed most right now, is to take some of this research, this cutting edge science into human flourishing and well-being, and get this into a language that is digestible and applicable for business and organizational leaders, because they are the ones who can have this really outsized impact in terms of getting this, and in some small way or often very large way, having a positive impact on the lives of millions and billions of people. And so that's part of the spirit of this video. That's also what I do with my consulting practice, Happiness Means Business, which you can find our channel as well on YouTube. Is really trying to take, on this channel, I talk a little bit about maybe more so some personal applications, but I also have a vested interest in trying to take a lot of this work on flourishing and happiness and getting it into the business and working world as well. So I hope this video in some small way helps with that. So if you're interested in more of the topics from this video, please leave a comment or reach out. I'm happy to share with you. Check out Harvard Human Flourishing Program and Shine, two super cool organizations if you're into kind of being a happiness nerd like me. And I think that's it for now. So I'll see you in the next video. It's been your happiness nerd, Jackson.